Hello, everyone. I believe we are.
Yes, hello, David.
Hello, Ashik. All fine?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I'm happy about our policy brief. I really like it. Good job.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen,
your contribution was very valuable.
Thank you.
We're about to start the event. Dr. Saeed, you can begin.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are. My name is Saeed al-Sheikh, and I'm the lead co-chair of Task Force 1 Trade, Investment and Growth. On behalf of CAPSARC and the Policy Center of the New South, I'm delighted to invite you to this webinar that will discuss the main two topics covered in the 10 policy briefs prepared under Task Force 1. It is my honor, and I'm very delighted to welcome Karim Al-Ayouni, President of the Policy Center of the New South, and Lucia Tajoli, Italian Institute for International Political Studies. I'm also delighted to welcome our speakers today and all participants. I also would like to express my sincere appreciation to co-chairs of Task Force 1 and to lead authors and to all participating authors and to Task Force 1 coordinator for their valuable contribution in the preparation of policy briefs and their hard work in reviewing and editing, besides their commitment to meet deadlines throughout these challenging and difficult times. To give you a sense of our journey and the preparation of the 10 policy briefs, each policy brief had a lead author and a co-chair coordinator. After first drafts were submitted, each one of them had been reviewed by one internal reviewer and two external reviewers. After reviewers' comments were incorporated, second drafts were submitted, and then they were internally reviewed by the coordinating chairs before the final submittal. Dear participants, the year 2020 started against the backdrop of a subdued trade performance in 2009, arising from trade tensions between the largest economies in the world. Moreover, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, global trade decline is expected to worsen even much further, exceeding the trade fall brought out by the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, and more likely to drop much steeper in sectors of complex value chain linkages, particularly in electronics and automotive products. In addition, services trade will also be hard hit, attributed to the imposition of restrictions on travel and transport and general lockdown on economic activities. The COVID-19 pandemic has had severe implications on the global economy, but developing countries have been experiencing much sharper declines in economic growth and export earnings. The shortage of resources to support economic rebound was heightened by high dependency on exports of natural resources to the international markets, which already have been affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. In our MENA region, attributed to the restrictions on mobility along with lockdown and economic activities, global oil demand collapsed, thus accentuating the already weaker oil prices due to price wars between oil producers, with a very sharp fall in oil revenues not seen in a long period of time. Therefore, the issue of COVID-19 has been very much relevant to the policy briefs of this Task Force 1, especially given its focus on trade, investment, and economic diversification, as the pandemic represented another challenge on top of the already existing challenges facing the multilateral trade system, which arise from protectionism and unequal opportunities to access the global value chains, besides many legal issues related to digital trade and trade and services. Task Force 1 believes that the pandemic demonstrated that the multilateral trading system is needed more than ever in order to minimize disruptions of the necessary means to meet the current and upcoming health and economic challenges. To meet that end, it was recommended in one of the policy briefs that G20 should start a dialogue at the multilateral level in order to reform WTO and its functions. Also still in the WTO space, particularly regarding the industrial subsidy, it is highlighted in one of the policy briefs that in the absence of multilateral arrangements, it is recommended to explore a plurilateral path, but in a broad rather than member-targeted reform to tackle the subsidies problem. In its policy briefs, Task Force contributors discuss the potential rebound of world economic activity. While it is doable, it will only come by keeping international markets open and predictable, as well as by fostering a more favorable business environment for sustainable foreign investment in order to lessen the impact of the pandemic, especially on primary resource-based economies. In this context, it has been recommended in the diversification policy brief that G20 should assist in broadening of the export base through global value chains, which would help in maintaining stability in export receipts and generating economic growth. This policy brief warned that a turn toward protectionism, which took place by some countries during the first few months of the pandemic, would introduce other adverse implications on top of the challenges the developing countries are currently experiencing. As we have been experiencing, the current pandemic crisis necessitated social distancing around the world, which opened the door for a much wider use of a range of digital technologies and cross-border services. This has received attention from Task Force 1, and it has been recommended in some policy briefs that G20 has the opportunity to assume leadership by implementing best practice policy and by creating interoperable regulatory settings in order for economies to reap the productivity benefits of these digital technologies. Following these introductory remarks, I'm honored now to invite Karim Al-Ayouni to give the opening keynote speech for this webinar. Mr. Al-Ayouni, the mic is yours.
أهلا وسهلا. السلام عليكم. Thank you, Dr. Said. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me first start to thank the excellent work that has been done in the context of the G20, and particularly the work that is gathering us today on trade and diversification. I'd like to special thanks to CAPSARC that has been quite dynamic in interacting with us as think tanks, and also my colleagues Uri and Abdelaziz, as well as their co-authors, for an excellent work. I have a couple of remarks. It will not be a full-fledged introductory speech, but let me share with you a couple of ideas where we stand as, as think tanks in, this was mentioned by Dr. Said, in difficult times and, sort of unprecedented uncertainty maybe for someone of my generation. I'm 50 today, by the way, not today exactly, but as we speak. So I think the degree of uncertainty we are seeing is, is quite high. And of course, it affects trade for many reasons. And I think the first point I would like to make is a sort of confusion in the public between trade, globalization, multilateralism, as a sort of confusion in the eye of the general public of something that is negative and that has not been benefiting them. And unfortunately, as we are, economists very much pro-trade, and we understand very well the benefits of trade and the rule-based WTO system and all the progress that were made, in the past 50 years, although they've sort of slowed down in the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years. I think in the general public, it still is being seen as something that has been benefiting the elites, sort of globalized, elites that are, getting the benefits of globalization and trade. And we have a serious problem because the demands from population to their government is a demand of more protection in the broad sense, more security, less uncertainty. And for many politicians, of course, trade is a very easy scapegoat and a sort of easy response, a very populist response to the demands of population. And if we take the example, and this is the second point, how it has played, it's being actually, unwinding and being played during the COVID crisis, is sort of this national pride, of responding to the crisis that we've seen all around the world, that has in sort of superseded international cooperation and solidarity. And we've seen, demands for population, again, for security and protection from their government, provide, tests, masks, and all sort of services, in terms of health. And the response were national. Let us see on the vaccine, there's sort of international cooperation, but still it's also a race of, where the ego and the pride of countries as being at play. And I think this is, I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately, on the outcome and the coming months or year on that front. I think there will be more of those policy, more protectionism, and more because of the demand of the population, because of the mood of population asking for more protection. This wave that you've all observed of repatriation, renationalization of light manufacturing activities. Everybody has realized, they're very simple, they're not very productive and complex and sophisticated, sort of, building masks and stuff like that. And people just realized that they were dependent, particularly, in Europe. In Morocco, we have been doing quite well on that because we still have, textile industry. But populations are asking from their government to deliver these kind of services, and it's unfortunately seen, as a sort of anti-trade, protectionism way of seeing things. My third point in that context of this complex nexus that combines politics, globalization, multilateralization, and trade, and nationalism and populism. My third point is our role as think tanks, and I think this is here I have really to, to congratulate all the participants, and I think the think tanks community and the G20 in a way for providing this space, a space where I would say fact-based analysis, reason, belief in science still drive our exchanges and our dialogue. And I think I see the role of think tanks as even more important in these situations, allowing us to sort of inform policy and raise awareness to the general public. in our specific role that is, a very complex value chain of decision making, where think tanks have a special place, which is a place where they sort of bridge between academia, and science, which can be a little bit, confusing and not necessarily easy to understand, and decision making, which is more operational. We've seen during the COVID, the urgency of taking decisions and the sort of misunderstanding of what can science deliver. And we've seen many governments, surrounding themselves with doctors and high, top scientists around the world, and nobody agrees. Nobody agrees, there's many cases of that. And I think academia is one thing and science is one thing. It has its own place and it has its own dynamics, and it's of course very important. It's a source of growth and productivity and reason. But at the same time, decision makers need to decide and to make policies. So this is where we have a specific role. First, we provide a platform for this kind of serious, organized, fact-based dialogue, but also to create this platform that is a bridge between academia, science and decision making, because our teams are, and most of us will look the same. We have, young staff, young economists, young, specialists of global affairs, but at the same time, we have very senior people that are retired, and it's a very unique mix where there's also a sort of training, dynamic that is being generated, and it is very virtuous, and that we value a lot us here, because let's think also about the next generation, how, they will address what is their feelings, what is their stance toward, a more open world with the, rule-based WTO system, with the, an open, trading system with complex value chain organizing themselves across countries. So, and I think it's not enough to do the demonstration that it is beneficial to the population, because it's also not necessarily true, by the way. There are inequalities that have been generated by this process, and we need to take care of those. And of course, these are in general local and national issues, but they should be at the center of the debate. Many industries, many people working in labor markets have been being transformed by this complex process of dividing the production across country. So it's a little bit what I wanted to tell you, where we stand us here in Morocco during these very special times, and how we see our role as think tanks, and reiterating our interest in pursuing the dialogue with you, and valuing and cherishing and being very conscious of the value of our community as think tanks, of our people. Actually, this is all about people, and being able to dialogue across at least many countries. As we're not member of G20, I have to ask to especially thank the T20 think tank members for their very open posture, and for inviting us to be able to contribute. And the last word is to let you know that we are here, and that you can count on us on this activity, on our high spirit to continue to promote the good work we all do. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Ayouni, for your insights. Certainly very interesting thoughts. And now we follow with the agenda. And I'm also delighted to invite Mr. Ackerman, Director of G20 Studies Center at Tepiva, Turkey. He will give us a talk on the general introduction about challenges facing trade and investment systems. Mr. Ackerman, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Sheikh, and hello to everyone. And thank you very much for organizing this event. Actually, I'm Said Akman, one of the co-chairs of this task force, and I'm director of G20 Studies Center at TEPAV, Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, and I'm also an associate professor of international trade. Well, when we talk about trade and trading system, trade has been a constant topic actually in the G20 agenda since its beginning. So the leaders of G20 countries always in their annual statements have persistently referred to trade as one of the major pillars of economic growth. But in practice, we see that many countries, including the G20 countries, actually do apply measures that are not very much compatible with the trading rules and also limit trade. That is a dilemma, and we know major reasons for this. But I would like to just raise a couple of points with respect to rules-based multilateral trading system, which is under stress for a long time. First of all, trade protectionism is rising, as you know, with new types of beggar-thy-neighbor measures, including export incentives, including localization measures, including state aid policies and state interventions, in addition to all these restrictive measures that we all know. And all of these measures actually today require a new set of rules. Second, this actually increases trade tension among countries. And these tensions are being increasingly politicized under the geopolitical divisions between major stakeholders. And they are actually applying unilateral measures in nature and often bypass WTO rules. And this brings us to my third point, the WTO itself as the main pillar of the multilateral trading system. It loses its centricity as argued by many scientists and or even policymakers, and currently faces a crisis. I call it a make or break point actually for the WTO. Its three main functions face challenges. The first one is WTO is providing a forum to negotiate liberalization and to establish new rules for major issues in trade policy. Second, monitoring trade policies, and thirdly, resolving trade disputes. So, against this backdrop, let me raise a few points before the panel discussion. Maybe we can provide some background for our panel discussions. That WTO so far has produced, or despite its many successes, produced only meager agreements and meager results, while confrontational issues are prevailing and still dominating the current trade interaction. This requires a complete set of comprehensive rules to be dealt with. Among these controversial issues, now we see industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, regulatory differences with respect to several topics, including climate change, labor standards, national security measures, export barriers, and digitalization of trade. In addition to this, we also have to consider unresolved trade issues like agriculture and development, which are important for the developing countries. So overall, the global trading system today requires a new rule to make the WTO and the multilateral system be more responsive to the transformational changes in the global economy. Especially in the post-COVID-19 process, we will need this even more. However, we see that putting rules is not an easy process under the current WTO culture. First of all, we need to achieve consensus almost in all issues, a very important pillar of WTO culture. But this needs to be refined actually to provide further, to allow further negotiations. The second, the special and differential treatment. This is another fracturing point between advanced economies and developing economies, which is another practice in the WTO culture, as you all know. There is no agreed definition of what is a developing country. This is a self-designated concept, actually. that leads also, on the other hand, major advanced economies, particularly the United States, to apply self-defined unilateral, but in most cases controversial measures. So the G20 leaders actually reaffirmed in every statement they had their support for necessary reform of WTO system. But we know that major stakeholders have strongly differing views in many of these issues. So that needs a real reconciliation. This will not be an easy process. And I know that despite these differences embedded in the reform proposals by different countries or country groups, G20 still constitutes a critical mass of global trade and investments and a major platform of dialogue, as its members are quite important major players of the trading system. This could help to build a mutual trust. That's what we need, first of all. And secondly, make concrete plans rather than just words for necessary reforms to realize these proposals stipulated in the G20 statements. With respect to WTO, and upon this issue, I would like to raise very briefly some points that we also dealt with in the policy briefs in the task force. The first issue I would like to raise your attention is digitalization of trade. And new technologies are developing and they actually help trade keep flowing despite these lockdowns or restrictive measures during the COVID-19 process or pandemic. However, rising protectionism also surrounds the digital trade and digital services and electronic commerce. Taxation of digital services, regulation of trade-related flows, data flows are integral parts of the debate. The next thing I would like to remind is the COVID-19 pandemic, which actually led many member states of the WTO to introduce initially some restrictions on essential products first, but in the long run, they have the challenge of disrupting global value chains, as you mentioned, Mr. El-Sheikh. The next point I would like to raise is the need for the diversification of trade, which was dealt with in some of the policy briefs in the task force. Many developing countries are actually in need of diversifying their exports. And the trading system is expected to facilitate, to support this. And as one of the policy briefs rightly mentioned, these reforms of the world trading system and the WTO itself, spearheaded by the G20, can help promote this diversification process at the country level. The last point is the need for a robust and viable rules for sustainable investments, because investments are just another part of trade, and the rules are that are vital to bring more predictability and stability to investment environment are needed, even more than the availability of some kind of mechanisms to protect investors and ISDS mechanisms. So we need rules first, concrete rules, and that create predictability. I think this is also an important point to raise. With respect to task forces, policy briefs, actually, initially we had more than 50, I think around 55 submissions, where only 10 policy briefs have been selected in line with the priorities of G20 and in line with the priorities of task force. And all these policy briefs have been contributed by experts and co-authors representing various think tanks. And that was the importance of think tanks. Actually, Mr. Al-Ainoui already mentioned their importance, and from different academic institutions in different countries. The policy briefs were peer reviewed by the co-chairs and also by 2 anonymous referees. That was an important innovation during the Saudi term, I know. And each paper have been presented in different events in various T20 and site activities and received feedback also from the policymakers. Before I finish my words and leave the floor to my colleague, Peter Draper, for moderation of the first panel, let me put forward some of my expectations from the coming Italian presidency. First of all, trade issues must continue to be taken up in the agenda of the G20. Also during the Italian presidency, I believe it will be one of the priority issues because WTO reform process needs further attention. Second is the presidency of Italy should encourage the G20 members to provide a concrete mandate through its subcommittees like Trade and Investment Working Group to start a deliberative dialogue platform on critical issues. This is the way to start with. This may be one of the ways to start with on how putting words into real action. And more important and relevant to think tanks and T20, more sustainable and institutionalized coordination should be established, I believe, between policymakers and engagement groups. This has been done in several occasions during your presidency, Mr. Al-Sheikh, but we need further institutionalization also in the coming presidencies, especially T20 task forces on trade and investment issues help this working group as well. These are some points I would like to raise before leaving floor to the panel. And thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity and also participating in different activities during the task force. And I appreciate your invitation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ackerman, for your insightful speech. And certainly we all learned from you, and you definitely participated in several events, and you contributed greatly and appreciated the great work that you have done through this process of preparing the policy briefs.
It's my pleasure, actually.
This speech sets the background for the next panel. And we have a 1-hour panel discussion, issues on trade. It will be moderated by Peter Draper, Executive Director, Institute for International Trade, University of Adelaide. Mr. Peter, the mic is yours.
Well, thanks very much to Said. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And I particularly like to thank you for your leadership and of course, CAPSARC and the Saudi Arabian hosts for pulling together, I think, a very formidable and interesting set of policy briefs. I think Dr. Akman has already previewed the work of the task force as a whole. My task now is to focus in on this particular panel. And so I'll just do that by very quickly scoping out the topics to be covered in this panel without getting into all the details, because that's really for the authors to provide. So the panel is weighted towards WTO reform, various issues within the WTO reform box. So we will start with an overall perspective on the core issues at the heart of the WTO reform agenda, which I think Dr. Akman has already set out, and he was actually the lead author of that policy brief. So that's policy brief 1. We'll then delve into some of the important and very intricate institutional questions at the heart of reforming the WTO. And that will be led by Professor Tu, and that's policy brief 2. Then a core issue which Dr. Akman referenced, and I think we all know this is a growing challenge in the WTO context and the global trading system in light of COVID-19 and the actions that various governments are taking to rescue their economies in many ways and societies. And that is the issue of industrial subsidies reform in the WTO context. So that policy brief was one that I led, but it will be presented by my colleague at the university, who's a co-author, that's Dr. Nisha McDonough. We'll then pick up through Policy Brief 5, which Augustin Redonda will speak to, and he was the lead author on that. A very interesting and, again, complex set of issues that have something to do with the WTO for sure, but their own logic, and that is tax expenditures in relation to international trade. And I'll leave Augustin to explain exactly what he means by that. And then finally, last but by no means least, a very important topic on the international investment agenda, which has obvious trade implications as well. And of course, the task force covers trade as well as investment. And that is reforming ISDS, or Investor-State Dispute Settlement, and the implications of that for trade and investment cooperation. So that will be led by Krina Mihaila, who I'm meeting for the first time online. It's a pleasure to meet you, Krina. I think everybody else I have met previously. And I'm looking forward to your presentation of the policy brief. So I'll take the presentations in that order, starting with policy brief 1. And I'll ask Fabrizio Botti, Senior Fellow at the Istituto Affari Internazionale, to lead off for the 5 to 7 minute presentation. Fabrizio.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me also express my gratitude to the Saudi T20 Secretariat and the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation to participate in this interesting discussion on trade issues. I had the opportunity to get involved in an inspiring collective research effort with other colleagues and co-authors. Said Akman just introduced the discussion in the 2 sessions. Said was our lead co-author, but also Axel Berger, Peter Draper, and Andreas Freitag, Piercarlo Padoan, and Claudia Schmucker. This study led to the policy brief, as you said, of the task force on trade and investment and growth. We touched on the reform on the WTO, and there are several points in our brief that I would like to raise and try to discuss with you all. The premise of our studies, I mean, it's well known, it's common knowledge. There's an existential crisis of the WTO, with all its main functions involved and becoming progressively ineffective, especially rulemaking and the appellate body. There are several reasons, but we can say that WTO failed to respond adequately to the challenges of an evolving and increasingly complex trading system. And as a result of several factors, we can say the expansion of global supply chains, growing geopolitical tensions, as well as the emergence of new global challenges, and we can say climate change, digitalizations, and others. But significant diversity in global trade participants from, above all, economic point of view, such as development levels, degrees of economic integration between major global actors, pose serious challenges to global collective action and the WTO, especially for a member-driven and a complex organization whose decisions are based on consensus. As a result of over the last few years, discussion on the reform of the WTO have intensified a lot, and if the G20 leaders recognize the need for reform since the Argentinian summit in 2018, discussions intensified during the pandemic this year with uncoordinated trade policy initiatives, trade restrictions applied to medical, but also other essential supplies emerging during these years. And just refers to some of the insights that provided Said Akman in his introduction, but let me just go to our policy brief to what are the WTO member reactions to these challenges emerging in the global economy. Mainly, we identified 4 major courses of action. One relates to this dispute and settlement mechanism in the WTO. On the one hand, we can observe a number of cases under the dispute settlement mechanism that proliferated. At the same time, members failed to clarify the rules, so judgments started to be delivered under a sort of ambiguity. Then the development of non-multilateral tracks, especially regional trade agreements. The aim of them is, of course, to liberalize trades and bring in new rules and disciplines, but these initiatives are part of a rule-based system, so they do not challenge the principles and norms of the multilateral trading system. But by nature, they are discriminatory as a matter. The trend in the population of these non-multilateral tracks can be to go towards separate trading blocks with their own regulatory spheres. And that is a risk, of course. Then unilateral measures and countermeasures. Both are costly and disruptive to trade patterns and global supply chains. Sanction then could lead to the breach of the WTO law and above all, eroding the rule-based trading system. Then several plurilateral agreements were negotiated. That's what we observe, and achieving the consensus in WTO is costly, is painful for several reasons we already discussed, and particularly for the economic diversity of its membership. Despite some limitation in the plurilateral negotiation, they can bring progress. And especially when multilateral agreements cannot be concluded, but they need to be open and they need to be based on an inclusiveness principle in a way to enable outsiders to join at a later stage, and should be multilateralized by taking them within the WTO framework. In this context of a changing or a challenging global framework faced by the WTO, but also with the aim to keep multilateral dialogue open and recognizing the role, the key role of the G20. We propose some recommendations, several recommendations. I just go quick through them just to provide some input for discussion. The first was to the G20 should initiate a deliberative dialogue platform. And of course, we know that the G20 members represent a critical mass of global trade. They both involve advanced and developing countries. They debate in G20 concept have not to replace the WTO as a forum for negotiation and rule making. The G20, as already was introduced by Saeed Akman, had to empower the Trade and Investment Working Group to improve dialogue. And the Trade and Investment Working Group should establish institutional, sustainable dialogue with T20 Task Force and other engagement groups such as the B20, for example, but also NGOs, in order to collect a deeper understanding of their perspectives. Then to promote a progressive approach to systemic controversies, this is something that needs to be adopted, especially for the development dimension of policy dialogue, and namely the special and differentiated trade. It has been already touched by Saeed Akman, this point, the fact that G20 should be equipped to cope with global contingencies such as the pandemic of COVID-19. The effect, the distorting effect to trade is very relevant, and at a time when we are confronted with this, a functioning global trading system is very important to ensure an efficient supply of critical products, above all equipment and medical products to fight the pandemic. In addition to policy dialogue, formal negotiation, we stressed the need to experiment on new cooperation mechanisms or soft mechanisms to improve global trade governments. Soft mechanisms, global governments have been used in other multilateral environment. We know pledge and review mechanism, collaboration between independent agencies, other mechanisms that should be considered by the G20 for global trade governance. Assess the possibility of achieving consensus through, for example, blocking minority and plurilateral agreements, as we already discussed, and then consider a number of reforms to preserve and improve the function of the WTO by ensuring transparency and monitoring. Then the Trade and Investment Working Group should establish committees to reform the issue of subsidies and to provide core principles to guide negotiation. That's another important aspect. Then the G20 must ensure that trade restricting measures are implemented consistently with the WTO. Still, through the Trade and Investment Working Group to identify failures and implement measures consistently with WTO framework. Then the WTO reform have to achieve disciplines on digitalization of trade, and we made some proposal on that. Finally, one crucial aspect, of course, in order to re-equip the WTO, its formal enforcement power is to resolve the impasse and prevent the collapse of the dispute settlement mechanism. The initiative of EU and others, Australia, China, and other nations on contingency and multi-party interim appeal is a concrete and interesting initiative. Of course, you cannot permanently replace the dispute settlement mechanism, but there are a couple of principles that is interesting to follow. The fact that it's open, and the fact that it's consistent with the WTO framework, as it operates under the Article 25 of the DSU. Thank you very much, Peter, and all of you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, and not least for sticking to the time. It's a complex topic, and you've done a formidable job of condensing the issues. I'll turn now to Prof. Tu Xinquan, who's in Beijing. Xinquan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you for your invitation. I'm honored to present a policy brief on behalf of our distinguished group, led by Mr. Axel Berger. The purpose of this policy brief is to provide some ideas to promote WTO reform, which has been talked for a couple of years, but without significant progress. We mainly cover three issues, i.e. negotiations, regime management, and decision-making. But I think these issues are also covered by other policy briefs. Maybe we can exchange our ideas with each other. We believe that the stalemate in the negotiations on the Doha Round has led to pessimism for the future prospects of multilateral trade governance in the WTO. The bicycle theory seems to be still applicable to the WTO. While the current whole package and round negotiation approach does not work well, the WTO should take more flexible and feasible approach to make movements. Based on the history of the multilateral negotiations, the open plurilateralism is arguably the best alternative. It has several obvious advantages, such as its application of MFN, no requirement of consensus, applicability to both market access and regulatory issues. However, the existing WTO system has no statutory guidelines and principles for the launch, negotiation, and implementation of open plurilaterals, leaving some uncertainties and concerns for many developing members. So we suggest that these negotiations should be open, inclusive, development-friendly, transparent, non-discriminatory, and more importantly, benefiting all members. To ensure those principles, the WTO should make statutory procedures to clarify the conditions for the initiation or conclusion of open plurilateral negotiations, while formulating future rules to assess the economic impact of forthcoming plurilateral negotiations on participants and non-participants in advance, and to examine the possibility of acceptance by members. As for the role of the G20, it could initiate a dialogue on the principles, procedural design, role of the Secretariat, and selection of topics for open plurilaterals to advance rulemaking in the WTO. The second suggestion is about improving the regime functioning of the WTO. A key function of the WTO is to ensure transparency concerning its members' trade policies. Monitoring should be strengthened by creating small independent expert groups that support the WTO Secretariat in analyzing trade policy within the context of the trade policy review mechanism. Presentings should be made in the capitals of the reviewed countries to collect more information and invite more attention. And information technology tools must be explored to make these processes more inclusive. Another challenge is to make the work of WTO committees more active and efficient. A promising first step might be to conduct an internal or external WTO-wide review of the performance of the different bodies in the organization. The way forward should entail the strengthening of deliberations within the various committees and increasing their impact. For example, we suggest that the committee chairs should have the mandate to create ad hoc working groups that are chaired by the Secretariat and ensure better use of WTO in-house expertise. With regard to the decision-making mechanism, a working group within the WTO should be created to map out which core decisions need consensus and which decisions could be guided by the idea of a super majority. So I think the consensus decision-making principle is a big issue for the WTO's functioning. Many people are doubting the applicability of this mechanism. So our idea is to classify those different actions in the WTO and apply different decision-making approaches to different actions. For example, budget negotiations could be concluded by a supermajority or day-to-day activities in relation to regime management and enforcement. Regarding the selection of the DG and members of the appellate body, a supermajority could also be envisaged. So then in this case, the current stalemate of appellate body appointment could be avoided. For the G20, we believe that it should focus on promoting dialogue on the functioning of the WTO, including the role of open plurilaterals, regime management, and decision-making. There is a need to improve communication between key actors and build mutual trust. But of course, we know that maybe most needed thing right now in the world is mutual trust. Moreover, the G20 should engage key stakeholders of the trading system, including relevant international organizations, in a dialogue on the deficiencies and the benefits of an effective, legitimate, and inclusive WTO system. We believe that the WTO could learn from other international organizations in terms of the operational approaches and the operational system. The G20 presidency should reach out to the G20 engagement groups including like Business 20, Labor 20, Think 20, Civil 20, and seek their inputs on WTO reform options. Of course, we all know that the WTO reform is still in the stage of wider discussions, not serious negotiations. So we believe that different inputs, various inputs are still very important for finding the best options, best ideas of promoting WTO reform. So this is a brief introduction of our policy brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xin-Huan. Again, a very rich menu of options to choose from. We'll turn now to another vexed issue on the international trade agenda, which is the issue of industrial subsidies reform. And Nisha McDonough will present Policy Brief 3. Nisha.
Peter, thank you for that introduction. And I would also like to thank the T20 Secretariat in Saudi Arabia for hosting the event. It's been a pleasure to participate throughout. So Peter was the lead author of this policy brief, and co-authors included Andreas Freytag, Henry Gao, and Simon Evanet. So quite an illustrious cohort, and it was really a pleasure and a great experience to work with them. So as Peter mentioned, this is really a very vexed issue, and as Kareem mentioned at the start, since over the last decade, or well, since 2008 really, there's been increasing calls from the public for politicians to deliver protectionism, to deliver reshoring, and that's a call that's also been massively amplified by the recent crisis. And these kind of political dynamics are just becoming more and more prevalent and predominant within domestic politics, and very hard to resist. So with our policy brief, we were kind of the starting point in a way was looking back to 2008 and looking at that trend with an eye on the G20 and looking at the development of the G20's anti-protectionist pledge to begin with, because they could see the trend that was developing, and those members actually pledged that they would ensure there wouldn't be any protectionist explosion of policies. So during that period, nonetheless, there was 14,000 policy interventions which did favor domestic firms over foreign rivals, whereas there was about 5,000 or so liberalizing measures. So it wasn't totally one-sided, but we can see there was a significant greater amount of protectionism which ended up emerging. A lot of that was in the form of subsidies. So Simon Evanet's Global Trade Alert highlighted that of 6,000 subsidies implemented by the G20, over 3,000 were financial grants, over 1,000 were state loans, and then there was about half that again involved in tax and insurance relief. So these were some of the kind of, that was that trend that was well established before we had the disaster that became the global pandemic. And a number of multilateral failures that others have noted as well amplified these issues. In particular, we would have to discuss here compliance. So there's been a significant fall in subsidy notification rates by members. 50% of members are about 2 years behind, while 1/3 of all members are 5 years behind. And as the old saying goes, what cannot be measured cannot be controlled. And that's as true now as it ever has been. Particularly problematic has also been subsidy litigation within the WTO DSU framework. The archetypal case here is Boeing Airbus, which has been 16 years in the making. And that's at the extreme end, but all the cases are long, slow, and tortuous. And by the time anything's resolved, the damage is normally done. There's been conflicts over interpretations of the rules, in particular with regard to the idea of public body. So the definition was a government or public body provides a financial contribution within its territory that confers a benefit. And of course, over time, this was narrowed down by the appellate body to refer to entities vested with or who exercise government authority, which have kind of made the idea of SOEs being listed there as more difficult. There was also an excessive burden of proof. This has been a general problem even for transparent economies to prosecute cases to do with subsidies. But this is multiplied significantly in non-transparent economies. So these are the kind of multilateral issues that have amplified problems with subsidies. And there's been, as we said, a very deep political dynamic. And in that general context, our policy brief was really concerned actually with the political dynamic, with understanding the issues, but with understanding the political dimensions and really trying to think about a circuit breaker of some sort. How do we actually get some sort of dynamic, constructive engagement towards dealing with these issues? How do we get a conversation going and a process going to actually start working through them? So what we're trying to do in the brief is identify possible paths for reforming and disciplining the use of subsidies by members in a manner that's consistent with the multilateral framework, but really given the current gridlock at the WTO, we thought that this could be best led initially by G20 members. As Syed Akman mentioned, the G20 is still a critical mass grouping, and we thought this is where it could be best placed to actually get this up and running. So when we looked at what are the big players thinking on subsidies reform, what are their positions, in particular, we pointed out the trilateral cooperation, which is the EU, Japan, and the US. So they've released 3 statements in 2019, identifying policy recommendations with regard to this issue. And a number of commentators, ourselves included, kind of thought, well, this is more of a China reform than a general reform, or could be perceived that way. It really focuses down on state-owned enterprises, non-market practices, and industrial subsidies. So that's on the one side. And then on the other side, main players, China have also submitted a reform agenda to the WTO. They're looking at things like expand the list of non-actionable subsidies, improve rules on security exceptions to prevent misuse, which would be targeted at the US, one might reasonably assume, tighten rules on unilateral measures contrary to WTO rules. Again, one could reasonably assume that's really aimed at the Trump administration's recent activities. So what we kind of found there is that these positions by these very important members, I mean, if they're not going to agree, nothing's going to happen on subsidies, but they were pointing in different directions. They're very different concerns and very different issues. So this was raised the implications of a diametric opposition. And in trying to think about that in terms of a political process that could be constructive, we thought a broader reform package would be required here to increase scope for trade-offs. So start to maybe bring in other people that might, other members that could tag on to different aspects of both reform agendas and try and build a more critical mass engagement that would make space for those kind of trade-offs that might actually let something happen. Secondly, for any industrial reform proposal to meaningfully update WTO rules, we understood that more players just need to be at the negotiating table. So then again, that was brought us back to the G20 idea, and that this would represent the most systematically significant economies, and we could incubate a process here, a political process. So that's the context and the substance of our thinking. So that brings me to the proposal. So we thought the G20 should establish a subsidies reform subcommittee. Now, this could be comprised of senior trade and finance ministry officials. Both sets of officials would be required to cover the trade and industrial policy, as well as the financial and broader economic policy dimensions that come with subsidies. That's why we wanted both sets of ministers. The committee's scope would need to be sufficiently broad that it can address issues beyond industrial subsidies per se, because this is where we can get into the space for trade-offs. The remit would have to be multi-year. It would have to transcend the immediate G20 presidency at hand, because we have to accept and acknowledge this is going to be a long, slow, probably torturous process. So it's going to take many years to work through this, to build up relationships, to gather the space, to open up the space for scope, to gather in more players, and to work through these very politically sensitive matters. So another aspect of the proposal then is that the meetings of the capital-based officials for the G20 should be mirrored in Geneva. Now, we thought this would be very important here to have these mirrored with regular meetings with the WTO delegations. The idea here is that there is still an ongoing link maintained with wider WTO reform and those discussions that will be taking place in Geneva. Alongside that, informal channels could be maintained with non-G20 WTO members, many of whom would, of course, have a sustained and serious interest in subsidies reform and the negotiations. So this is the type of proposal we think is more likely to facilitate a landing zone in Geneva, which is a necessity for any kind of WTO rule changes that are going to be implemented. However, we also were aware throughout the thinking process that, because going back again to the idea of gridlock, that whatever's happening in Geneva, we try and keep that engaged, but the G20 has to keep moving either way and build up a head of steam and take the lead. So the mirroring process is an addition, but it shouldn't be allowed to hold up the whole process. So just a couple of final points here. Organizing principles, the focus needs to be on subsidies that have the potential to generate really large negative cross-border spillover effects on trading partners, because these are the most contentious type and the most damaging. We think there needs to be acknowledgement and allowance for subsidies aimed at achieving legitimate social goals. This could be again reviving the green light subsidies trial that was held when the SCM was first signed in 1995, and for 5 years there was a green box for certain socially legitimate subsidies and for achieving certain social goals. And also, we would argue competitive neutrality must be a core principle undergirding this entire process as well. So I guess the final point I would make is, when we were doing the work on this and looking how established the negative trend is on subsidies, was kind of dispiriting. But in a sense, history can be your friend here, because if we look back to the Uruguay round, we see there was two very sharply divided camps on agricultural reform. The US wanted a very draconian reinforcement of disciplines on the use of subsidies, but the EU had a very different perspective. They wanted a much broader scope for their socially legitimate type usage of subsidies. And after about 4 or 5 years of practically zero progress, there was actually eventually a deal done. So in that sense, looking back gives some hope for looking forward. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Nisha. So subsidies are obviously also intricately related to taxation, and it's to taxation and tax expenditures that we'll now turn, encompassing a range of institutions, not just the WTO. So Augustin, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. So thanks, by the way, for the coordination of the task force and for the invite to the Secretariat. It was a pleasure. So this policy brief that I worked with Facundo Calvo from the WTO representation of Argentina, Gilles Carbonnier for the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Robert Koopman for the WTO, Raul Merotra from the Graduate Institute as well, Professor Ima Mosquera Valderrama from Leiden University, and myself. So let me jump directly into the challenge that we find here. So we all know that international trade and taxation are inextricably connected. Taxes, for instance, are a key determinant of business activity, business location decisions. They are crucial to attract FDI, foreign direct investment. Clearly, the main channel of this connection between trade and taxation lies on corporate income taxes and the whole story about tax competition, but it actually goes beyond this. So taxation has a broader impact than only through corporate income taxation. What we observe is that during the years, through the G20 processes, different G20 processes, taxation and trade were part of the main agenda of the G20, main topics covered by the agenda of the G20, but somehow tax expenditures have been somehow neglected. So what are these tax expenditures that this brief will focus on? These are all type of tax incentives, benefits, tax reliefs, including exemptions, reduced rates or deductions that governments implement to pursue different types of policy goals, including the ones of attracting investment, obviously. So the idea in this brief is to cover different topics that are core to the discussion of tax expenditures and have some implications for international trade. So we cover 4 main areas or subtopics within the brief. The first one regards of the design of tax expenditures and the use of these tax incentives in order to, as tax competition instruments, in order to erode other countries' tax bases. So this is a long-standing issue and discussion that you are very likely all aware of. But what is crucial in the discussion of this brief, we think, is the lack of transparency. So there are some efforts by the WTO or the Global Trade Alert by Simon Evenet that someone mentioned before, in order to gather data on tax expenditures when it comes to the impact as determinants of tax treaties or international trade flows. But there is a very important lack of transparency gap in terms of data. So our recommendation here in this particular topic is that multilateral coordination is crucial. So updating global tax and trade agreements to ensure coherence in the context of the G20 it's something that the G20 should keep pushing. Policymakers should certainly consider the principles underlying both global tax and trade cooperation agreements and how best to ensure that these are effective. And this is even more relevant or pressing in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic. Many countries have been tempted to introduce distortive tax measures to support their economies or to ensure that the recovery from the pandemic is smooth. This should certainly not go against international trade governance. In our second topic, we assess a similar scenario or situation regarding tax competition, but with specific focus on the digital economy. We heard already how important the digitalization of the economy is during these days, and we see that many of these tax incentives that are being implemented in order to capture from one side a share of the digital economy, but also to erode other economic tax bases, go exactly through the digital economy. So again, here our recommendations regard respecting the international trade governance, in particular in the context of the digital economy. We know that the OECD, within the BEPS project, they have been trying, in coordination with the G20 obviously, have been doing a remarkable job in terms of how to deal with the taxation of the digital economy. But there's a lot to be done, and the role of the G20 is crucial. Countries, particularly G20 member countries, but also non-G20 countries, should prevent the use of wasteful tax incentives for e-commerce activities. And if implemented, they should come up with a framework where evaluation, assessment, cost-benefit analysis are implemented to ensure that these provisions are actually value for money, are not only implemented as a tax competition instrument. In the third piece, we move into CO2 taxation. This is another crucial topic with several trade implications, particularly, but not only, in the context of the EU and the Green Deal. So we know that carbon pricing is clearly, by far, the most economically efficient policy to reduce greenhouse emissions. Yet what you observe out there is that only roughly 13%, so 13% of annual global greenhouse emissions are currently covered by any pricing scheme. So we really lag behind the goals that were set during the Paris Agreement. And our recommendations here regards how the G20 has a role to push for unilateral carbon pricing schemes. So we agree that a coordinated or a global CO2 tax would be the first best solution or the most effective way to tackle climate change. We also acknowledge that we are far from there, and at this stage it might be seen as a utopia in many cases. So as a second best, we really encourage G20 leaders to incentivize unilateral actions to price CO2 emissions. And more concretely, what we suggest is the use of WTO compatible carbon border adjustments instead of granted costly and very often ineffective tax incentives in the context of CO2 taxation. So this can be seen as two sides of the same coin. but that changes the incentives behind the price scheme. So instead of granting tax exemptions for energy-intensive or trade-exposed sectors or industries, governments should penalize the imports from countries where no CO2 taxes or other type of tax is in place. And last but not least, we cover another critical topic, particularly for developing countries, but that also relate rich developed countries, many of those G20 members, which are illicit financial flows. So illicit financial flows, we know that significantly erode the tax basis of poor countries, and hence, as a result, their capacity to mobilize domestic resources, which is crucial, for instance, in the context of the SDG Agenda 2030. When it comes to developed countries, some major trading and financial hubs like Switzerland, where I sit, but also Singapore, the UK, and the United Arab Emirates, attract illicit financial flows and hence expose themselves or their financial sectors to regulatory and financial risks related to tax evasion, money laundering. So we know there's evidence showing that tax expenditures, tax incentives, or export-related tax incentives are one of the main determinants of illicit financial flows. So one way of trying of contributing to the reduction of these financial flows would be to actually phase out those tax expenditures that kind of trigger these activities. There are also in the brief we also come up with other suggestions that are not really related to tax expenditures, but for instance to improve statistical infrastructure to uncover trade and transfer mispricing. That's also a crucial trigger of illicit financial flows. And also governments should support better trade transaction valuation in order to accurately record whether this physical trade occurs between related businesses in order to avoid abusive transfer pricing. So again, these are four different topics that we think are crucial in the context of taxation, particularly tax expenditure, and their impact for international trade, and where we think the G20 has a significant role to play. So I will stop there.
Thanks very much, Agustin. Again, a very meaty agenda, lots to dwell on there. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to discuss it all. I'd love to take you up on border carbon adjustments, for instance, but that's just one subject. So let's turn now to Krina, who's going to take us through ISDS reform in relation to trade and investment cooperation. Krina.
Thank you very much, Professor Draper. Thank you very much for having me here and all of us encouraging this discussion. I'm representing the policy brief addressing the reform of investor-state dispute settlement and promotion of trade and investment cooperation. I am a senior lecturer in international arbitration at Stockholm University. The policy brief is chaired by Professor Lucas Mistelis at Queen Mary University of London. And we have our colleagues from different jurisdictions engaging in this very interesting debate around investment and the way forward. And I could hear, and that is very interesting to hear that we have trade and investment, they do go together, but it's interesting to see that the proposals, they also match investment protection and promotion with trade directions and WTO. And it was mentioned that there is a need for a predictable and stable investment environment, and one could not agree more with this. At the same time, we should raise awareness and make sure that decisions and reforms are made based on data, available objective factors, and not simple perceptions. At the same time, the current pandemic showed us that there are still problems to tackle and perhaps new challenges for foreign direct investments. And one example would be how governments communicated with foreign investors at the beginning of and I could hear from you as well, from the perspective of trade in general, that there was a lack of transparency, and this is one important point. We have the agencies, the investment agencies in the countries during this pandemic not engaging that much with the foreign investors. To add to this, some of the measures taken by states during the response to the COVID situation could raise concerns as to the protection of foreign investments. So all this are adding to the general debate, which was started obviously before this unfortunate situation. And the challenges that are posed to the international investment law and investor-state dispute settlement are twofold. The first one coming from the nature of the system as such. We're in the presence of a very fragmented system. We have over 2,000 international investment agreements and free trade agreements also dealing with the protection and promotion of investments, and over 2,000 treaties of this kind. Obviously, they come with different provisions, specific provisions. At the same time, the dispute settlement mechanism is largely built on the rules from international commercial arbitration, and that is one of the main criticisms. At the same time, the second part of the challenge is that investment law and investor-state dispute settlement, like trade, is an evolving system, and we all want the system to respond to the challenges of today and not to the challenges of yesterday. So as we could hear, sustainable goals, sustainable investments are the key concern for the future. At the same time, we have to tender also the needs of the states. The system that it is put forward at the moment, it is a system of protection and promotion of investments. It is not a system where states and investors have rights and obligations at the same time. And this connects with the previous point on sustainable investments. Of course, we also have different players in the field. And I think one of the key concerns for the future is to make sure that small and medium investors are also recognized and their concerns addressed. So with these twofold challenges, the proposal of the policy brief is to follow this multilateral or plurilateral approach in investment law and investor-state dispute settlement. We are starting from a point when we do have various reforms currently put forward. One is before the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, the UNCITRAL. The reform before the UNCITRAL is of the investor-state dispute settlement. And is an ongoing discussion. I think it enters into the third year. And we also have a discussion on reforming arbitration rules, therefore also focus on investor-state dispute settlement before the World Bank, the institution concerning the dispute resolution and investment, which is Illicit, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. So these are the two main reforms happening, and they do collaborate with each other. However, these proposals, these reforms are only addressing the procedural aspect of the system. So they're, as I said, they're focused on the dispute settlement. They do not address substantive protection or substantive rights and obligations in this current system. Now, you heard about the challenges, about the concerns with the system, but we have to acknowledge that the system as it is and as it was built has major advantages. And the first one is to allow investors to be removed from the jurisdiction of the national courts and to be present with the state and engage in a resolution of the dispute at international level. And this comes with the, as we say, depoliticization of the system. So we are in a neutral setting, and arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism is recognized for having this essential characteristic of neutrality. As such, the policy brief suggests to keep and to enforce this characteristic of the system. It is essential for, as it was put forward, a stable and predictable system to make sure that it's free of influence and both states and investors can benefit from the advantages offered by the system. As such, we make 3 proposals, and of course, I'm happy to discuss this further because I think there is a lot of synergy between the proposals put forward by the policy briefs. The first one, as I said, is to enact a multilateral or a plurilateral investment agreement in the form of a treaty. And this one, this instrument has to address both substantive and procedure, both the substantive rights and obligations, as well as how to address any breach of this obligation. Therefore, a unique system comprehensively and addressing also the fragmentation of the system. There is no such instrument. There have been attempts to engage in such a multilateral instrument, but unfortunately all failed. We do believe that the current situation of the pandemic will stimulate discussions allowing this inclusive approach of addressing all concerns in one instrument. It is also important to stress the fact that dispute prevention should have an important role in this instrument, in particular in the setting of virtual dispute resolution and virtual rule of law, if one would like to call this. It is important to prevent disputes and not to engage in disputes. The second proposal of the policy brief concerns the creation of a new institution. And this institution is not meant to compete with other institutions of the kind in the system, which are mainly designed to administer dispute resolution. And I gave you the example of Isds as a part of the World Bank. The purpose of this institution, which we'd like to propose to be located in a G20 country, but outside the traditional investor state dispute settlement centers, is to provide policy advisory work, capacity building and training, and a hearing center where these disputes should be heard. So what we're trying to propose is basically raising awareness and addressing this concern of perception related to the system. The third point and the last is a proposal that reconciles private interests with global interests. And you could hear at the outset, I could hear from you as well, that we need to address global interests such as human rights and environment, as well as actions regarding climate change. Therefore, any legal regime concerning foreign investments should play and has to play a significant role in fostering a healthy regulatory climate for investment that takes into consideration these pressing global priorities that I mentioned above. As such, just to conclude, we think that it's important to have this inclusive approach in reforming the system. We need that this is healthy to engage in discussion in the T20 and approaching G20 with these proposals. And we seek support for this multilateral investment instrument, as well as for this institution that would create a level playing field in the system and raise awareness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Krina, and thanks very much to the panel for being highly disciplined. It's a rich menu of options and analysis that's been provided. and hopefully it will be absorbed by all G20 officials and enacted immediately. But we'll have to see whether that takes place or not. So my thanks again to the panel, my thanks again to Dr. Said and his colleagues at CAPSAC for hosting all of us. And back to you, Dr. Said.
Thank you, Peter, for moderating this session, and also thanks to the speaker and for their valuable contributions. Now we move to the second panel discussion. The topic of this panel is diversification and digital and technological investments. We have 5 policy briefs and we have 5 speakers. I'll be introducing them one at a time. And I would start with the first speaker in this panel discussion, Carlos Braga, Professor of Economics, Fundação Dom Cabral, Brazil. And Mr. Braga will talk about the export promotion or export expansion and its implication on diversification. So now I invite Mr. Braga to deliver his presentation. Mr. Braga, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Said. I hope you are listening me well. I'm speaking from São José dos Campos in the state of São Paulo, Brazil. And I'm speaking on behalf of the group that prepared Policy Brief 8. Uri Dadush was the team leader, and we have several colleagues involved in the preparation of this brief. The first point that I would like to make is that this brief touches on many, many points that we already heard from the other presentations so far. So these are the good news. The bad news is that many of these issues are challenging, and I would like to share Peter Drape's optimism about prompt implementation of the recommendations, but my experience in the past, for instance, as acting secretary of the Development Committee of the World Bank and the IMF, suggests that that's not an easy thing to accomplish. But we should keep our hope. So let me focus on what is the main question that this policy brief addresses. And the issue is how export diversification is affected by trade policies, including multilateral rules, regional trade agreements, and national measures. And we all recognize that for most developing countries, particularly for low-income countries, export diversification can be an important aspect of getting less volatility in the context, for instance, of exports, given the predominance of primary commodities in these countries. Diversification is also associated with economic growth, but of course, for policy purposes, it's misleading to view diversification as causing economic growth. Instead, it's best to think of diversification and growth as jointly determined by sound fundamentals, including good governance, etc. Today, when we look at rich nations and their trajectory in terms of export diversification, the focus is typically on the stages of diversifying from agriculture to manufacturing, and then to increase role of services. But this traditional path is less prevalent today. Actually, we, of course, believe that diversification is still possible, but be it because of the rules of the game, be it because of automation, we need to think a little bit differently. Today, diversification often entails exploitation of specific niches, for instance, in the context of a global value chains, the role of a small and medium enterprise becomes much more significant. And this, to a certain extent, are good news. The same thing, of course, applies to the close relationship between trade and foreign direct investment in the world economy today. Now, it's true that countries, particularly developing countries, can benefit significantly from export diversification. But the reality is that the trade system, broadly speaking, is not supportive of diversification. Policymakers usually think of export diversification as a shift from agriculture to manufacturing, as I already mentioned. We in this paper took a broader perspective, that is diversification within sectors and across all sectors. In other words, we are also interested in diversification within agriculture and towards value-added, higher value-added agriculture, within service and towards service, etc. One way to look at this, and the paper analyzes this information both for industrialized countries and developing countries, is to use indices of concentration of exports, like, for instance, the TAIL index. And what we can show very clearly is that between the 1960s and the middle of the past decade, we saw significant diversification among advanced countries in terms of their export portfolio. It's also interesting to note that in the most recent years, there was a trend towards concentration because exactly of the expansion of global value chains, fragmentation of production around the world. So diversification was not sustained at the same levels in advanced countries as what we had seen, for instance, in the 1980s. But advanced countries have a very diversified portfolio. If we look at the developing countries, however, and we go through the different regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, Middle East, North Africa, are the regions with the lower level of diversification. Latin America and the Caribbean have advanced a little bit, but the two regions among emerging economies that really have made a difference in terms of diversification are Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and of course, China played an important role in this context, but also Eastern Europe. Now, diversification requires us also to look in terms of the quality upgrading of exports. So if we enter this dimension in our analysis, we will observe that in most cases, there was not a significant upgrade in terms of the value added of the exports of developing countries. Most of the diversification occurred primarily at the intensive geographic margin, reflecting growth of exports to China and other Asian and European developing economies. Much less so an improvement in performance at the extensive margin, new products, and this suggests that we have not seen a profound structural transformation in most developing economies. Of course, there are exceptions. As I mentioned to you in the beginning, I'm speaking to you from São José dos Campos, which is the location of the main plant of Embraer, the third largest aircraft producer in the world based in Brazil. So there are examples that we can mention in terms of significant success with respect to export diversification. But the reality is that in most cases, this has not happened in a significant manner. And why is that so? Well, we come back to the issue that I raised at the very beginning, that the system in general, trade systems, be it at multilateral level, be it at national level, it's very important to emphasize this, there are significant barriers to diversification. If we look issues like tariff escalation, if we look issues like tariff peaks, exactly in those products that are of particular interest to developing countries like agricultural products, you can see that there is a long way to go in terms of improving the overall environment for trade. And it's also true if we look at manufactured products that consumer goods typically face much higher tariff and non-tariff barriers than is the case for intermediate products. And all of this conspires against diversification of developing countries, be it with respect to agriculture, be it with respect to textile and clothing. And there is, of course, a difference between MFN tariffs and applied tariffs. Applied tariffs are relatively lower than MFN tariffs because of the great expansion that we have seen in terms of preferential trade agreements, but these come through with very restrictive rules of origin that also impose barriers to diversification. So another area that we have to emphasize, and other papers in this panel will expand on this, is the role of services in trade diversification. Services nowadays are the glue that made it possible the dramatic expansion of global value chains. So be it the dynamism of ICT-enabled services, mode 1 of trade and services in the GATS context, be it commercial presence, the aspect that I already mentioned about the importance of foreign direct investment, mode 3 in the GATS, be it the servicification of manufacturing. Is enough to remember that when we talk, for instance, of an airplane like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, we are talking about a product that has 6.5 million lines of code software to make it a feasible machine. The same thing with electric cars. In the case of the Chevy Volt, 10 million lines of code. This opens opportunities for developing countries, but it's quite true that this will require also major change in terms of the barriers to trade and service that are typically of a regulatory character, and then to be more complex in reality than barriers to trading goods. Restrictions on foreign entry, for instance, GATS Mode 3, the regulatory complexity are important barriers to trade, not to mention restrictions on the movement of people, mode 4 in the GATS, a situation that at this moment in the context of COVID-19 has become, of course, an additional area for concern. So we make a series of policy recommendations, some of them at multilateral level, the importance of reducing tariff escalation, tariff peak, and high tariffs that constrain value addition in several sectors of interest to developing countries and constrain diversification, strengthen and update rules to tackle trade distorting subsidies, something that was already referred in one of the previous papers. And in the case of agriculture, domestic support measures have also had a negative impact on production in trade with high concentration in specific commodities. We need to tighten disciplines on export restrictions and export taxes, which are particularly important for the exports of natural resources. We have to leverage the GATS platform and to reignite a round of services trade liberalization. In this context, suggestions about a plurilateral route that was mentioned before in the context of WTO reforms is probably one important way to explore this. Rules for investment facilitation, which dovetails with some of the recommendations that we just heard. And of course, the importance of agreeing on a framework to govern digital commerce to reduce transaction costs and create new opportunities and sources of value addition. Now, all of this has to be complemented, and it's important to stress, with measures at national level. So most of the problems are enshrined in the trade policies of both industrialized and developing countries. And we also go to a series of recommendations in this area, including the need to support the integration of small and medium enterprises in international trade. So these, in a nutshell, are the main points that we make in the paper, and I would like to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Braga. You know, in the interest of being able to manage this session within the time allowed, I urge all the speakers to limit their speech to 6-7 minutes. And if we have few minutes left before 4:30, then we'll be able to accommodate some questions. Now I turn to Mr. Matthew Stephenson, Policy and Community Lead, International Trade and Investment, World Economic Forum. Mr. Stephenson, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Said. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for organizing this webinar to share these policy briefs. And I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors the policy brief on how the G20 can advance sustainable and digital investment. But maybe I will have 5 points, and I'll try to keep it brief to 5 minutes. But before, let me just say how much a pleasure and how honored I am to come after Carlos Braga and before Jane Brockman. Maybe after this panel, I will retire because, you know, it doesn't get any better than this. So what are my 5 points? First point. In 2020, because of COVID, foreign direct investment is expected to fall by 50%. At the same time, the importance of digital transformation has, according to some firms I've spoken to, leaped forward by 5 years. So this is a tension and there's a need to address this. Second point, how do we address this? In our policy brief, we suggest that economies, the G20 and national economies, need to think about digital FDI and attracting investment to grow the digital economy. They can do so through creating what I call digital-friendly investment climates. We propose in the policy brief a way to think about this because digital activities may require very specific and different policies and regulations and measures compared to traditional economic activities, because digital firms leverage data, technology, platform economies, and others. So in the policy brief, we build on an UNCTAD framework that suggests you need to think about 3 different pillars to attract digital FDI. You need to think about policies and regulations that enable investment in new digital firms, policies and regulations that enable investment in adopting these digital technologies by established firms, and third, in digital infrastructure. And we carried out a survey to try to understand what were the priorities, the priority actions in terms of these 3 pillars to create digital-friendly investment climates. And so the first recommendation would be for economies to think about and embrace this approach of creating digital-friendly investment climates using this framework of 3 pillars, and then to launch either national or regional efforts to do so. The third point, we don't just care about digitalization for digitalization's sake, but what we really care about in all this, I think, and building upon my previous colleagues' remarks, quote, sustainable investment is the key concern for the future, unquote. We really care about sustainability and investment for sustainable development. And so our policy brief lays out a framework of how to think about that, because there's been a lot of work in this space, a lot of efforts from the World Bank, the OECD, the private sector, and so forth, all pushing in this direction. We propose a unifying framework of 5 dimensions of sustainable investment. The 5 are sustainable investment policy, sustainable investment finance mobilization, sustainable investment promotion, sustainable investment facilitation, and sustainable investment development impact. And so this allows us to sort of understand the different levers, the different measures, the different tools that can be used to advance sustainable investment flows. And we lay out in our policy brief very concrete, actionable measures, 10 to be exact. And I'll just give you one to give you a flavor. Investment incentives, which have been talked about by my earlier colleagues in several policy briefs. Investment incentives can be realigned, repurposed, so that they are aligned with sustainability and development goals, as well as digital goals. Basically, instead of being broadly given as location-based incentives, they can be tailored and targeted more effectively to produce a certain behavior in investors, behavior that is aligned with international development goals, standards of responsible business conduct, as well as the actual development and digital development goals of that economy. Fourth point, how do we do all the above? It's not so easy. We've basically outlined a big, difficult, complicated agenda of digital investment, sustainable investment. In our policy brief, we propose the need to create what we call an investment support program through a G20 investment facility and fund. And this aligns quite closely with earlier policy brief recommendations, the need to create an institution to organize and orient all of this work. So the facility would coordinate the various actors in this space that are pushing in the same direction, but that a cohesive framework and a coordinating mechanism could help align the efforts. The facility would also help organize public-private cooperation in this space, which is critical. You need the public and the private sectors to be working together. And we propose a global alliance for sustainable investment facilitation to really identify concrete jams, bottlenecks, capacity constraints, especially in developing countries and LDCs, and address them. And how do we address them? Through the fund, which provides the resources, the technical assistance in order to be able to do so. Fifth and last point, while it sounds like the sustainable investment agenda and the digital investment agenda are separate, in fact, we really should see them as one. We should increasingly need to unify these and to see these reforms as really dual-headed and dual-purposed and dual outcomes of advancing development, the digital space, and economic sustainable development at the same time. And let me explain why and give you 2 examples. The United Nations just a few months ago called or presented a roadmap for digital development cooperation, where it really lays out how inclusion in the digital space is necessary, is needed and necessary to really drive the next wave of sustainable development in the world, especially given the digital transformation taking place. So here we have sort of a call to action, bringing together the sustainability and the digital agenda. And just to illustrate with one very granular example, so to make this real, if you think about supply chains, which other colleagues have talked about in this webinar, a firm can use digital tools to better manage supply chains more efficiently through blockchain or through monitoring, delivery of certain items. At the same time, these digital tools can be used to ensure that the items being delivered, are delivered with a least carbon footprint and less energy expenditure, and traceability to ensure that they come from a factory that produced them according to responsible and sustainable business and investment principles. So really, if you think about it, these 2 agendas can come together. Those are my 5 points. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson, being able also to manage it within 5-6 minutes. And now I move to the third speaker. And it's a privilege and honor to introduce Jane Drack-Brockman, Industry Professor, University of Adelaide. Thank you, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Sheikh. I think we all know, and Matthew's presentation has also highlighted this, that we are in the early stages of a major technological transformation. We call it the fourth industrial revolution. It's driven by digital technologies, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, Internet of Things, 5G. And these technologies are dramatically cutting trade costs for digital delivery. And that's putting trade in services on a much stronger growth path than trade in goods. Now, if we look back over economic history, such periods of radical technological change and the resulting structural shifts, despite all the dislocation involved, have ultimately delivered the biggest, most prolonged global growth stories. And with the right policy choices designed to connect our digital economies and enable businesses to interconnect, interoperate, this wave of deep business innovation is offering us all our single best, shared, and immediate chance for productivity gain, economic growth, and rising living standards. And for the authors, all 15 of us of this policy brief, nothing could be more important in 2020, a year of marked economic discontinuity with trade and investment in general retreat and many of our economies in serious recession. What 2020 has not witnessed, however, is any slowing in the pace of digitalization. On the contrary, the health pandemic has seen an intensive and accelerated shift to digital. We're all more aware of it now than we were. We're not meeting face to face today, but we are meeting. It's very exciting, and there will be no going back. But the G20 needs to manage this transition. And as Dr. Al-Sheikh noted right at the beginning of his introduction to this webinar, G20 leaders need to implement best practice policy and regulatory settings, which means they first have to know what those are in a new and rapidly changing age, that allow trade to flourish while at the same time attaining domestic public policy objectives, including to manage dislocation. So in our policy brief, we make 8 high priority recommendations. 8 is a lot, and I don't have time to go into them all in detail. So I'm just going to give you a taste and hope you enjoy reading the paper itself. But I'm going to cluster them into 4 general sets of issues. The first set relate to essentially updating the rules for digital trade. There are many aspects to this. I'd like to highlight just a few of them. The first is we need to recognize that cross-border data flows fall under the definition of trade. And we need to introduce disciplines enabling freedom of cross-border data flows. This is because digitally enabled services in particular are fundamentally dependent on inputs of data. It is the key resource. And trade in digital services is dependent on cross-border data flows. So much so that access to data has become a key driver of firm-level competitiveness, especially for SMEs. So whatever the motivation, whether it is cybersecurity or privacy, consumer rights, industrial, digital policy, the reality is that restrictions on cross-border data flows are prevalent and they are impacting negatively on productivity and trade. Actually, you know, the business story is that out there in the international marketplace, it's a regulatory jungle. The emerging digital economy is in danger of fragmenting rather than globalizing. And we really need a coherent common framework on data flows. But there is more to the trade rules side of this story. We need all G20 members to join the WTO negotiations on e-commerce as observers, if not as full participants. And we need improved market access for digital delivery of services. There are relatively fewer commitments for liberalisation under Mode 1 cross-border trade and services than any other mode. We need to uphold the WTO moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. Now, there's been a lot written about the moratorium over the last year. We spend some time in our paper looking at the practical difficulties and the economic inefficiencies of levying tariffs on electronic transmissions. And we argue the value-added sales taxes offer vastly more efficient, more practical and more equitable ways of raising revenue. And ultimately our recommendation there is around calling on the G20 to commission a joint study of the options. A second cluster of recommendations relate to regulatory cooperation, which is closely tied to the trade governance framework. Two key aspects to this: we call on all G20 members to adopt joint principles for domestic regulation of services. We draw attention to an important model out there in the APEC region, the non-binding principles for domestic regulation of the services sector. And we call on all G20 members to signal their support for the emerging reference paper on services domestic regulation in the GATS Council, and willingness to bind their GATS schedules accordingly. We feel this is a key important step, including because efficient, non-discriminatory services regulation can drive technology diffusion, helping firms everywhere participate in this new industrial revolution. The other aspect to regulatory cooperation is privacy. This is something we focus on because interoperability of data privacy is going to be a fundamental linchpin of any new data governance. There's been a lot of discussion on this ever since the 2019 G20 meeting and Japan's initiative for data-free flow with trust, but it's still the hardest issue. We argue that interoperable regulations are a more realistic goal than harmonized regulations. So in a nutshell, it starts with domestic policymakers ensuring that their legal framework clarifies that firms that have a legal nexus in their jurisdiction are responsible for managing data in a certain way, wherever the data are transferred, wherever the data are stored. So the country's data protection rules travel with the data. And potential models of how to achieve that outcome are there in the OECD privacy principles and also in the APEC cross-border privacy regime. There is a third cluster of issues which goes beyond the trade governance arena and focuses more on the need to boost digital aid for trade and to work harder on designing development strategies for digitalization. The key things that we pinpoint here are the need for improved ICT infrastructure, for accessible and affordable internet connectivity, digital skills, and the supportive regulatory framework. But our aid for trade must be better geared in those four directions. The final set of issues that we look at are all ones that need to be handled back in our own domestic economies, if you like, but in a collaborative way rather than an inward turning manner. The two that we look at are the need to upskill the workforce for digitalization. And the key recommendation there is about education reform, the need for cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary and vocational education. And the other area is how we stimulate digital innovation. One way, of course, is to ensure that our technological architecture is open and that we are providing the right kind of intellectual property regimes. But even more importantly, we're arguing that innovation ecosystems, domestic systems at home for innovation, need to be a lot more outward looking and need to be collaborating with each other, because when we're talking about global trade being all about global value chains, we have to think about global value creation, collaborative value creation across borders, and our innovation system should be geared that way from the start. So those are the, in a nutshell, the key aspects of our recommendations, and I urge you to read the paper. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And now we move to policy brief 9, diversification in the MENA region. It will be presented by David Haverland, Research Fellow at CAPSARC. David, the mic is yours.
Good morning, or evening, or afternoon, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me well. I had some issues on a meeting 2 days ago, so if something goes wrong, just let me know. On behalf of my co-authors, I will now present kind of the main findings of our policy brief on economic diversification in the MENA region. So the MENA region consists of quite heterogeneous group of countries. We've got countries ranging from high-income countries in the Arabian Gulf to middle income and as well some least developed countries. However, as it is situated, we believe that the position is ideal to represent a bridge between the global north and global south. So first in the briefing, we focused on the most pressing issues of the MENA region that are preventing economic growth, the potential, and prosperity. So we believe it's, as a list of them, we devote more kind of space to them in the briefing, is in most of the countries an outdated legislation, then quite restrictive business environment, which kind of gives time-consuming bureaucratic hurdles. There are no specialized development funds, there is no regional support for startups, knowledge-based businesses, and that means in general, innovation is lagging. At the same time, there is not enough credit provided for this type of businesses. There's tight capital access for pioneers of those new ideas. We see as well lacking infrastructure to employ skills and support talents. So we see quite some brain drain, especially to Europe. There are as well bottlenecks in logistics, and we've got in many countries underdeveloped internal markets. We have got some setbacks in human resources development, and in many countries, weak information infrastructure and still lagging digitalization. So we see currently that the economies and as well societies are in turmoil and transition. We see that economic conditions can change radically, short-term or long-term. We saw it with the COVID-19 lockdown. It had some profound socio-economic consequences, but also impacts on politics, trade, energy security, and maybe will affect habits and beliefs. So things change in general, and as it was said in the ancient Greeks, the compliant one is led by the destiny, the stubborn one is dragged along. So the general rule is adapt. And in the second part of the briefing, we tackle these issues and try to show how the bottlenecks could be improved and change. So we believe that the main sectors for adaptation and transformation are, in the first place, education, as it forms appropriate skills and incentives. Then the labor market, as it allocates these incentives, these skills, and improves them. Then the sectoral composition of the economy that decides whether you are producing in higher or lower value added production. It decides whether you have some research and development on board or not. And of course, international linkages. So in which position are you in the global value chains? How is the kind of trade flow and the security and resilience of supply? So we all believe that sectoral composition of the economies in the MENA region should change for most of the countries. A lot of them are actually being held hostage by oil price fluctuations or price fluctuations in other commodities. And this is about to remain in macroeconomic developments for the future. So they should make something to come closer to sustainable and diversified economies. However, diversification is a complex and perilous process. And it seems that the time is a bit running and may be running out, as has been highlighted by the COVID-19 lockdown. So you should do something and you can gain a lot. The countries can gain resilience, other sources of income, know-how, skillful labor force. So we ask the questions, which sectors have the high growth potential? What are the future pillars of growth? And what are the areas to focus on so that these kind of bottlenecks and hurdles could be overcome? So in general, of course, you would like to boost productivity, create the right job opportunities to retain and attract higher skilled employees, and create incentives for them to stay in the region. And not last but least, this kind of stage for economic diversification should be set right. And then we go into more details, and the most important things to focus on for the MENA region is kind of improve their integration into the global value chains. So this means revise trade agreements and support free trade flows. Then it's necessary to attract technology through foreign direct investment. So set the right stage for FDI inflow, which means fix the shortcomings that were named before. That would then again kind of bring into the region development of the human capital, which means a lot of support for private sector as this is the owner of the know-how. So they should do something, and we kind of address that in detail in the briefing, to attract the multinational enterprises, to make the business environment more attractive, reduce or remove some of the bureaucratic red tape hurdles, and improve the legislative clarity. One of the important roles we see is the role of the startups. So we believe it would be very beneficial to have some kind of MENA Startup Evolution Council or some body that would promote kind of the change on the regional level with respect to funding, support to the startups from the technical perspective, and cooperation. So when we go through this, then we conclude it's always very good to have a plan. So to come up to something that we call preferred diversification path, which may be different for each country. So we suggest it's really beneficial to kind of implement some economic modeling, such as the input-output framework that we use, for example, for the Saudi Arabian economy and its diversification plan. Because then you can discover the high growth potential sectors, you can see what is the right diversification path for your country, you can focus on sectors that create jobs and boost skills, and as well, you can focus on sectors that basically limit the environmental impact, such as renewables. So this would be all from my side. So if you read our brief, you will see the shortcomings, you will see the recommendations, how to tackle them, and how to kind of gradually arrive to a more diversified, more kind of sustainable economy in the MENA region. So thank you. I hope there will be some space for discussion, as discussion sometimes kind of shows unexpected perspectives. So let us enjoy, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, David. Now we move to the policy brief, Tim, and it will be presented by Arlene Karim, University of Hohenheim. And Mr. Karim, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Everyone hear me?
Yes, we do hear you.
Okay, I just want to share my, okay, let me share my presentation a little bit. Hope we can see it.
Yes, yes, we do see.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of, first let me thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate. And then on behalf,
Mr. Karim,
yes,
the mic is a bit close. It's creating this static. So just pull the mic away a bit.
Okay, are you hearing me now? Are you hearing me now?
Yes,
hello?
We do hear you, but there's an echo.
Okay, can you hear now? Hello?
Yeah, we
yes, we do. We do hear you.
A bit away from your mouth. Away.
Okay, a bit away, okay.
Yeah,
okay. See, okay now? Yeah. Yeah, on behalf of our lead author and the co-authors, I'm here to present our policy brief on Africa's diversification and its trade policy transformation. Of course, one of the major challenges that Africa is facing is the diversification of its products, especially export. Of course, as highlighted in Professor Carlos' presentation earlier, he said that Sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest diversification. And he also mentioned different types of diversification across the region. So diversification has really affected the level of Africa's integration into global trade. And besides that, traditionally, Africa has a little export base to trade. And recently, it has been said by the World Development Report of 2020 that Africa also are not well integrated into the global value chain. They are operating in the commodity level and also participating in the forward GVC level. So in order to overcome this challenge, Africa needs to improve its trade policy, need to transform its trade policy. And how could they do this? This could be done by enhancing their collaboration and cooperation with the G20. So in this policy, we emphasize the importance of extensive Africa G20 cooperation. And this is in terms of intensive and extensive trade that could enhance Africa's traditional trade participation, and also fully integrated in the GVC, as well as the development of regional value chain. And this will give a win-win situation for G20 and African economic relation. How could Africa do this? Out of all the various avenues to do this, this policy group has identified the current Africa Continental Free Trade Area as a veritable channel with which Africa could improve its level of diversification and also transform its economies. So in this way, we believe that the African Continental Free Trade Area offers a new entry point for Africa G2 cooperation. And this will enhance African trade and diversification and economic transformation. And this is in terms of the FTA will enhance intra-Africa trade through improved trade policy and trade policy harmonization and coordination. Also, this free trade area could also reshape trade with G20 through more attention to African markets. And it will also provide an avenue for this reciprocal and mutual advantageous trade and investment framework for G20. Of course, these are the things that we think if Africa could enhance the cooperation with G20, could also enhance the African level of diversification. Studies have done, ex-ante studies on the impact of African continental free trade area. They have found out that if this FTA is well implemented, it could lead to almost 15 to 20, between 15 to 25% trade growth, which is about between 50 billion to 70 billion additional trade for Africa. And it will also increase intra-Africa trade, which will be around 50% increase. Also, if this FTA is implemented, it could reduce the tariffs across countries because the continent has heterogeneous trade policies. And it will also increase the trade facilitation within the continent and enhance their competitiveness, thereby creating additional trade for them. However, caveat must be made that these gains, according to these ex-ante studies from UNECA and ARC, they found out that this benefit will be heterogeneous across countries, and it will lead to unequal diversification across the country level. So, in doing this, we identify in this policy review different challenges that Africa is facing in order to diversify and transform its trade policy. So, we out of this, I have reduced all of the fragmented it into 4 different points. The first one talks about the policy and procedural constraints. I want to talk about the poor trade diversification. The third one is limited initiative in the Africa G20 cooperation. And the last one is the inadequate economic transformation. Let me pick up these challenges one after the other. The policy and procedural constraints. Of course, in Africa, there are heterogeneous trade policy, which has hindered them intra-African trade and has also created bottlenecks for regional trade, regional value chain integration, and also African integration to the global value chain. So these are the first aspect. The second aspect talks about the poor trade diversification. Most of African trade, Africa has a very low share of global trade, and this is because of their export base. And because Africa is operating within the lower level of traditional and the GVC's trade, they could not increase their share. Over the past 20 years, their share has remained stagnant and very low. Also, another challenge is inadequate economic transformation. This economic transformation is developing into structural diversification. Most of African products are labor intensive. And of course, if one wants to gain better from trade and the global value chain, one has to move onto the higher level, higher step in the ladder. And that's why we are looking at the potential of Africa, moving from the commodity-based global value participation to limited manufacturing, or even to the advanced level, because studies have shown that countries like Bangladesh and others have also moved to from this stage. Also, we also look at economic diversification. This is in terms of the competitiveness of African products. Of course, Africa produce, in terms of scale economics and size economics, we see that if most of Africa products will not get advantage of this scale and size economy. So with this cooperation with G20 enhance African potential, that's what this policy will also look at. We also look at the challenges of technology. Of course, most of the development countries are associated with low technology. Technology in terms of the unequal across the continent, and this technology in terms of the level of production. The production level is not well developed. The science and technology is poor across the continent. So this also affected the technical know-how, which is the last point in this bullet. The technical level of education in Africa need to be enhanced to fit into the industry, to fit into the agricultural sector, which will have comparative advantage. So these are this is the level of technology. The level of technology in Africa is also a challenge to the continent. Also, African collaboration and cooperation with G20 is limited, with little initiatives. So we look at the possibility of enhancing this better initiative through this vehicle of a free trade agreement that is about to operationalize within the continent. So within this, we identify 3 proposals that will be will enhance Africa diversification and integration into global trade and GVCs. First, we look at the G20 could promote Africa's continental free trade implementation, and this is through financial and technical support for capacity building. It could also be through physical infrastructure and trade facilitation investment. Of course, we know that Africa lack or has inadequate infrastructure that will enhance better trade, that will also facilitate trade. So G20 could support Africa in this area. Also, we also look at sorry?
I want to remind you that we're going to have to come to a hard stop in like a minute and a half to 2 minutes.
Yes, I'm done.
Representative, thank you.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we also have a trade policy liberalization and partnership expansion. We think by sharpening world trade system reform to promote the diversification of export and trade-related export for African countries. Also, there's need for African trade policy capacity development to meet T20 protectionists. Also, we think this could be achieved by maintaining and expanding the existing preferential trade measures to all African countries, and also strengthening trade and investment partnership with African countries. So lastly, this proposal also says that support for Africa, G20 can support Africa's export competition through review of the G20 tariff and non-tariff barriers, support in strengthening of technical measures, assisting in strengthening African institutions. Africa must also, despite this expectation from the G20, we also take Africa to also develop their standard. They should also adopt international acceptable trade facilitation standard. They update their production infrastructure and also invest in research and development. And lastly, improve their capacity development. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Karim. And as we come to the end of this panel discussions, I'm afraid we don't have time left for the questions, especially that we have a closing statement now. And I will invite Lucia Terjoli, Italian Institute for International Political Studies, to give her closing statement. Lucia, your mic is
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me participating to this very interesting discussion. I will try to be very brief, so maybe there will be time for some question and answer after my intervention. I was invited to talk also from the Italian perspective, as you can see in the program, but I was honored to also contribute to one of the policy briefs. So I know, or I'm familiar with the work that has been discussed in these sessions. And I would like to say that I think that it is most of the things that we heard today are really points that I think all the panelists here agree with. I think they are very, very important, and they suggest useful and important paths along the way to follow for most countries. But given that I was asked to give, to some extent, the Italian perspective, let me highlight that I think that most of the things that have been discussed are extremely relevant if I see them from the Italian perspective for many reasons. And I take Italy as an example of the situation in which many, many countries could be involved nowadays. First of all, I would like to remind that Italy, half a century ago, moved from being a developing or emerging countries to some extent to a more advanced countries to a very large extent thanks to international trade and open markets, thanks to its integration with the rest of Europe, thanks to the fact that the development of the country took place in a situation in which international trade was expanding, barriers were lowered. And so really, I think that Italy is an example of a country that could really change standards of living also thanks to international trade. This was true half a century or more ago, but it is still true for Italy very much. Italy has been hit severely by the global financial crisis over 10 years ago, and by the crisis that in Europe followed that financial crisis. It has been hit very severely by the current pandemic, and unfortunately was one of the countries that was most hit, both in terms of human lives, but also in terms of economics by the pandemic. But one of the parts that really helped sustain the Italian economy, both after the international financial crisis 10 years ago and even today, is precisely the access to foreign markets, the possibility of importing goods and natural resources of many firms that in Italy typically are fairly small in size, of participating to global value chains and so on. So I think that this is really a case study for the role that trade can play in the economy of many countries. So I totally agree with many things that were mentioned today about the importance, even in this situation, of keeping open markets, open trade, and allowing the system to continue to work possibly at its best, even if we are very far away from what we would consider its best today. I think that for countries that are, let's say, mid-size, and let me continue to use Italy as a benchmark. Italy is a fairly large country compared to others, but it's definitely much smaller than the bigger player in the economic arena today. But for mid-sized countries, having a system of clear rules is absolutely crucial. So I totally share the view that we need to reinforce the current system of rules. The WTO badly needs to become more effective than what it has been in the past decade or so. And so this is one of the urgent topics that should be forefront in the agenda of any policymaker that is interested in having a global market that still works. The design, the institutional design of the WTO was probably already born old at the time in which the WTO was created, because the global situation and the players in the world markets are really, really different from what they today from what they were at the time in which the WTO was born. So I really think that this is one of the most urgent points to keep in this agenda. I also think that this setting of common rules, and something that really has to be thought again and redesigned, is very important to avoid another risk that has been addressed by many of the speakers today, the risk of fragmentation of the world markets in many ways. Fragmentation in terms of very local and regional trade agreements, fragmentation in terms of technological divide among different regions, fragmentation in terms of policy to attract foreign direct investments, etc., etc. So I think that finding a common set of rules that can be shared by everyone would be crucial to avoid the risk that markets will remain open and integrated only to in small clubs, only to the friends of the friends, and having a really fragmented type of market. There are already studies that highlighted that we've been talking for years of globalization, while what we have really observed is probably a semi-globalization or more of a regionalization. And this is something that I think is very much in the interest of many countries to avoid. Also, I think that for Europe, the risk of having a serious clash between the North American US type of economy and economic perspective and the East Asian evolution is a very, very high risk. And so even not only this is a very serious risk for emerging countries in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America, but I think it's also a very, very serious risk for European countries being caught in this type of fragmentation, if not clash, which we hope will not really become too serious. So just let me say that, as I said, I think that from the perspective of Europe, from the perspective of the of a country like Italy, most of the topics that have been touched today are really, really important, and they should be strongly supported in every policy agenda. In fact, I really hope that this will be done by the Italian government hosting the next T20. Unfortunately, we don't have a final, as far as I know, a final agenda yet, but the ideas has been to promote especially issues such as sustainability, which is clearly, as it has been highlighted, at the core of the evolution of the future economic systems. And also inequalities are something that I understand are in the agenda that the Italian government would like to promote. These are extremely important, again, to avoid the risks of fragmentation and divisions. So I think that there is a lot to do, but I also agree with what has been said, that we have as a think tank and scholars and teachers an important job to do here, because we really need to remind not only to policymakers about the relevance of these issues, but also to make sure that the relevance of these issues gets to the public opinion and to the society at large, to make sure that the society supports this type of policy decision. So here I think that this type of initiatives are also very important to put forward this agenda and keep reminding about the relevance of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia, for your insightful talk, also for your valuable reflections on what had been presented today. Certainly, you made a good summary of what had been discussed. At least you touch on the key points that had been discussed in the two panels. Now, and before we go to the end, to the last segment of our agenda, I'd like to extend my thanks to all the speakers and all the participants who stayed with us this whole afternoon up till now. And now we move to the last segment on our agenda, which is an art representations by Zaman Jackson.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Dr. Said. Before we do that, we will watch a video that first illustrates Mr. Zaman's work, and then we will have Mr. Zaman speak in Arabic with regards to his motivation behind his artwork. For all the panelists who do not speak Arabic, you will have within your Zoom window at the bottom of the taskbar the option to switch to English, as we will have a live translator for you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for the technical difficulties. There was supposed to be sound. The video will be on the T20 Twitter and all the social media platforms. And the option to hear Mr. Zaman's thoughts on his art piece is also available to all attendees and the panelists as well. Thank you. Mr. Zaman, the mic is yours.
أهلا وسهلا يا هلا ومرحبا فيكم جميعا. سعادة الأستاذ سعيد وجميع الأخوة والأخوات المتواجدين. أتمنى يكون الصوت واضح. كان ودي إني أتكلم إنجليزي، أنا أثق بالترجمة، لكن يبقى إحساس الصوت وإيقاع الصوت مهم جدا أيضا بعد للوصول. هذا صعب ترجمته بالتأكيد. ما أدري من وين أبدأ وكيف أبدأ. أتمنى في البداية تكون مداخلة خفيفة بسيطة، خاصة في نهاية هذه الأمسية الجميلة الاقتصادية، والتي أتوقع أنها أشياء كثيرة عميقة بعيدة شوية عن مجالي، لكن في النهاية كلنا إحنا نكمل بعض فيها. من بداية العصور الحجرية أتوقع كان الغذاء هو البداية الآمنة للإنسان. أول ما بدأ الإنسان في العصر الحجري يبحث عن الغذاء، حاول أن يشكل آنية. من بعد ما ارتاح وأحس أنه قدر يوفر له هذا الغذاء، حول الآنية إلى حفريات زخرفية وغيرها. فدخل الفن من بداية عصر الإنسان دخوله، وهذه مرحلة مهمة. وأنا أتوقع لا يمكن لأي حضارة أو نمو أو اقتصاد ينمو بدون ما يكون للفن موجود فيه. لذلك عصور النهضة لما نهضت معها الفن، نهض معها الثقافة، نهض معها الأمور هذه. أنا أشكر أن يسنح لي أن أكون جزء من هذه المداخلة البسيطة عن وجود الفن وأثر الكبير في الاقتصاد، في النمو، في الحياة كامل. قبل لا أدخل في العمل اللي عرض قبل شوي، كنت أتمنى بالصوت يكون موجود، لكن مثل ما ذكروا الإخوان بالإمكان متابعة الفيديو عبر وسائل التواصل اللي معروضة. حقيقة أنا فنان تشكيلي متنوع، يعني لي أكثر من 30 سنة تقريبا في الفن، وكان هذا المجال هوس بالنسبة لي إلى درجة أني كنت مدرس، تركت الوظيفة من أجل أني أتفرغ فقط للفن، وكنت مراهن على شيء مهم جدا مع أن نتكلم في مواضيع اقتصادية وتنموية. هل الفن يأكل عيش؟ هل بالإمكان الواحد يسمع؟ نعم. كان هذا الرهان صعب حقيقي، وخاصة قبل 10 سنوات في المنطقة الكثير يتفاجأ منه، لكن بالنسبة لي راهنت عليه والحمد لله. تحققت كثير من الأمنيات وتغيرت كثير من الأشياء في حياتي في ظل اهتمام كبير من الدولة بالفن. أنا أتوقع رؤية المملكة العربية السعودية رؤية ثاقبة، وضعت أيضا من ضمن أجندتها الثقافة والفن في أولويات اقتصادها، أولويات اهتمامها. لذلك أعطتنا إحنا الفنانين، وأنا ما أتكلم باسمي فقط، أتكلم باسم الفنانين جميعا إذا يسمحوا لي، أعطتنا مسؤولية حتمية إن إحنا نقوم بواجبنا أيضا إلى نهضة هذا الرؤية أو محاولة إن نشارك في اللي نقدر عليه. قبل أتكلم عن تجربة ولادة اللي انعرض قبل شوي، أوكي خليني أرجع قبل 10 سنوات، ما أدري الوقت كيف بيسمح لي، أنا ما بطول كثير عليكم، لكن تجربة ولادة هذه هي بكل بساطة كنت طالع إلى عمارة أبغى أصور منظر الشمس في غروبها، العمارة كبيرة جدا، فاستأذنت صاحب العمارة وطلعت فوق. تفاجأت من عدد الستلايت الموجود في سطح المبنى. هنا جتني فكرة غريبة، قلت هذا كل ستلايت موجود، كل دش موجود هنا، يغذي أفكار، يغذي معلومات إلى أصحاب الشقق، أصحاب المباني الموجودة في المبنى أو العمارة هذه. فاعتبرت أن الدش هذه منصة عالمية توصل المعلومات، هي منصة طبيعية. فقلت ليش ما يكون لي أنا كفنان تشكيلي أنا بعد أيضا منصة من خلال هذا الستلايت، من خلال هذا الدش، لأن شكله جميل. وفعلا أخذت الستلايت بحجم كبير، حجم مترين، حاولت أني أحوله إلى مولد اللي هو تشكيل فايبر جلاس أساس ساعدني الخامة، واشتغلت عليه على أعمالي كتجربة سميتها الآخر، وهو المجموعة كاملة من الأعمال الأساسية اسمها الآخر. لكن التجربة هذه وأهم التجارب اللي عرضها، لأن عرضت في الفيديو اسمها ولادة، وكانت تعبر عن ولادة الإنسان من بدايته حتى يعني حطيت آثار كثيرة من بشكل القمر، كيف ينبزغ القمر إلى أن يكتمل إلى بدر بإضاءة الشمس لكن بشكل القمر. يعني حاولت بقدر الإمكان أن يكون العمل فيه إضاءة صفراء، إضاءة الشمس، لكن على شكل القمر. كلها تتكلم عن نمو الإنسان، حضارة الإنسان، كيف ممكن القاعدة الأساسية تربية الإنسان تحول هذه الأعمال وتوصله. وأيضا ربطها، وكل الأحرف أو الكلمات المكتوبة المحفورة هي عمل يدوي طبعا، استهلك يمكن أكثر من شهر تقريبا، عمل متحفي أنا أعتبره، ومساحته أكثر من 10 متر مربع، كلها مكتوب محفور عليها وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. وهي عددها رقم 7 وأنا ذكرتها في الفيديو أيضا. 7 هذه دلالة كبيرة عندنا في الإسلام، وفي جميع فوجئت أنها موجودة في جميع الأديان السماوية أيضا، رقم 7 ودلالات وفلسفة فلذلك خليتها على 7 مراحل تنتهي في الآخر باليمين واليسار على قمرين مكتملين، هو المرأة والرجل. لا يمكن مهما كان الجدال الدائم بين المرأة والرجل، فيبقى وجودهم هو الحياة، هو اكتمال الحياة. لذلك هذه فلسفة العمل ببساطة عن هذه التجربة. وطبعا يعني أنا أعتبرها يعني نوع من أن تعطي فرصة حتى للمشاهد الآخر يعيش فضاء العمل داخل العمل، لأنه ما هو عمل، ما يعتبر عمل بينتينج، مع أني أنا أشتغل بينتينج اللي هو رسم بالألوان، وأنا متعدد الخامات مثل ما ذكرت، أحب أن كل شيء أمامي أشوفه أحاول ممكن يتحول إلى عمل فني. لذلك اهتميت بهذه التجربة، وجميل أنها تتناسب وتنسجم مع أيضا الندوة وفلسفة الندوة بكل بساطة. لذلك أنا أعيد وأقول جميل احتضانكم إلى الفن، أن يكون جزء من هذا المؤتمر، ونتمنى إن شاء الله يكون لنا حضور أكثر وأكثر، وشكرا لكم.
شكرا جزيلا لك أخ زمان على المداخلة الجميلة، وإن شاء الله نستمتع برؤية
participation, and I hope that we will watch your videos.
The video will be available, and the participants can access the video and also have the ability to listen to the or to read the translated speech of the artist. Okay, with Abdulillah.
Yes.
This is we come to the end of this webinar, and we again extend our thanks to all the participants and all the speakers, and to CAPSARC and to Dr. Fahad Turki, who has been with us, I think, for most of the time during the discussion. And goodbye to all of you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Much.
Enjoy the evening.
Thank you.
Very nice to discuss and to meet you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hope to see you next time.
Yes.